Okay, thank you. This is a slightly odd talk for me to give since USArray was being developed while I was in grad school, so I was at least born. But I want to make sure that I acknowledge a broad range of people who helped with this talk, especially David Simpson, and the many, many people, including many of you in the audience, that helped develop USArray. You've seen that these kinds of projects take decades to develop. It starts in rooms like this, where seeds are planted for ideas, and then moving from that to something where groups get together, maybe in the corners of meetings like this. They get together in hotel conference rooms. They get on the phone a lot and start to take something from an idea and actually make it happen. This is no different than SAFOD and PBO in that regard. So I'll present with again the help of David Simpson and others a few things about how USArray was born. So it started with a basic idea. I'll show a token timeline slide that seems to be required this morning. It requires community organization, leadership, and energy. So it's fine to have ideas. We all have great ideas, but you need a group that will actually get together and push forward. And you've heard from all of these projects. Ann Meltzer gave a very nice overview for EarthScope that in many cases, these are not projects that will help you in your own research, but actually help the community broadly. And if you look at USArray and you see some of the names that I'll present and some of the posters early on, some of those people have not even used USArray data. They're not in the room, and that's not because they don't care about USArray. It's because they realized that USArray was important for the entire community, not necessarily for their own science. There has to be a strong partnership with funding agencies. Certainly National Science Foundation has played a sole and critical role in USArray. And the coupled components of time and timing, and patience and persistence. So you have to get the time right, but you have to get the timing right as well. It's going to take time. Sometimes the funding's not there, so you have to be persistent, but you also have to be patient. So just as a quick snapshot as of last night, here's where we are with USArray status. This is from May 12th. Going back to the USArray report that Pearl Door sends out, on May 7th, there were 1,626 transportable array sites commissioned. And you can see we're very close to completing the lower 48. There's just a small group here in the central, eastern, and northeast that is not completed. So that's rather remarkable if you think about it. There have been many people kind of looking this map over the years, especially when you saw those early maps, and said there's no possible way that this could be achieved. There's no way to actually pull this off, even with enough money, in terms of the engineering. I think it's been clearly demonstrated through the USArray transportable array team. This has been able to be done and be done actually for less than what was initially proposed. So I'm not going to read through these key dates. I just want to highlight a couple of things. One is that you can see that 20 years ago, the notion of USArray was suggested, probably earlier than that, but drawing from some timelines from IRIS. Husnolet proposed what he called the Lehman telescope in the executive committee session of an IRIS board of directors meeting in 1993. Art Lerner Lamb and others proposed Matilda, which I see I've spelled incorrectly, but in 1994, a marching array to image lithosphere dynamics and architecture, sort of planting the seeds for what we know as USArray today. By 1997, you can see there's a USArray ad hoc committee formed. The Shearer Station map, the so-called measles map, was produced. I'll show you a couple of posters that were presented, and an initial attempt at what we now know as EarthScope, called the Integrated Earth Observing System, was proposed, and it didn't make its way up the chain all the way to NSF. It was considered not fully mature at that point, but suggested to be moved forward with a continued effort. In 1998, as you saw from Duncan, there's the original Plate Boundary Observatory, suggested to NSF through letters. That was really a coupled geodetic and seismic component, not what we know as present-day Plate Boundary Observatory. And then the names USArray and Array USA were exchanged. This came back and forth, eventually, of course, settling on USArray. By 1999, There's a head of steam moving along. There were many workshops. A white paper was developed. I'll show you some examples of USArray articles in a range of journals. And what's been termed the Dulles meeting with NSF and community leaders. And at this time, as I understand, this is where Jim Whitcomb coined the term EarthScope. So we move on to 2000. There were presentations at international seminars. And by 2001, things were really clicking along. There was a National Academy review. There were workshops, including design and science workshops. There's also a steering committee that had been formed and wrote a letter to NSF. By 2002, many more workshops as things continued to roll very quickly. The proposal was submitted in 2003, the MREFC proposal, and by the end of 2003, EarthScope was funded with awards to IRIS UNAVCO and Stanford for the 3 components of EarthScope. So here's an example of one of the ways that USArray was conceptualized. This is from an EOS article in February 1999. At the time, here was the current, in the bottom right, here's the current broadband network across the lower 48. 1997, here is the global seismic network in the lower 48, and then the worldwide seismograph station network in the upper right. And so combined, if you look at what at the time was called the U.S. National Seismic Network, plus 30 stations, this provided about 300-kilometer station spacing on average. And when you add the 2,000 stations, here's the so-called Shearer-Measles map. This is the extreme difference you get between 70-kilometer station spacing and just 300. And so this iconic image in the upper left is what was used many times during the proposals for and presentations for USArray, which included not just the 2,000 stations right in the lower 48, but broadly distributed what was called at one point webfoot on the west coast and the east coast of the US and Canada, as well as distributed stations in both Mexico and southern Canada, and then less dense but still an important grid of stations in Alaska. There's another article in EOS in June of 1999. This was led by Alan Levander, Gene Humphreys, Jeroen Ekstrom, Ann Meltzer, and Peter Shearer, and really looking at what can be done with high-density networks. Here's an example in the bottom left from the Snake River Plain from a transect across it. Here's a map generated by Ken Duker, which combined the long-period seismic images from a broad range of studies with the more local studies from several Pascal experiments. So you can see the differences in resolution. And in the upper right, just an example of kind of the long wavelength images that we had of the entire region at the time. November 99, Ann Meltzer and others produced a GSA Today article demonstrating what could happen with the USArray initiative. Here's an example taking the difference between just low-pass topography here in the center, upper center, and at the time, the best topography we had for the western US. And then again, another iconic image, a map of the stations. Ann Meltzer and David Simpson presented at NSF the notion of high-resolution imaging of North American structure, and again, using the idea that at present, at this time in 2000, you really could just see kind of this long wavelength structure. So here's low-pass topography again, just seeing, broadly speaking, things like the Great Basin and the Rockies, but in very blurry vision. This is at 300 kilometers or so. When you move to 80-kilometer wavelengths, you can start to bring some of these structures into focus. And then when you have 20-kilometer resolution, you can actually see some very distinct features. Things like the Snake River Plain appear. You can see the Rio Grande Rift. You can also see things like the plate boundary in much greater detail. Okay, so early on, and this is in the same presentation, there's also the suggestion of how a transportable array, it was termed at the time, would move. And so if you had, say, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 stations to 300 to 400 stations to march across the US at one point, it might look something like this. You'd break it up into sections. Here's the first year, here's the second year, here's the third year, and drawing that across, basically starting from the southwest, moving through the southern part of the US, and progressing to the east here in the fifth year, and then rolling back around in a counterclockwise fashion to get back to the Pacific Northwest. Now, from a logistical standpoint, this made a lot of sense. You keep the focus on various parts of the US, but knowing that there may be very interesting sort of earthquake behavior in the western US, perhaps relative to the east, then you want to keep the focus at both the beginning and the end of the project. You don't want this to roll into the East Coast and maybe there's no earthquakes. Of course, now we know that there are many earthquakes. But it was decided fairly early on that from a scientific standpoint, from an imaging standpoint, it made much more sense to move into a more sheet-like structure moving from west to east, which is what we have today. Okay, so as EarthScope then was funded, now moving forward to 2003, there were three components of EarthScope. This is, of USArray, and this is before the magnetotelluric component was developed later on. So with collaboration from the USGS, there would be about 35 high-quality stations across the US. There would be a total Advanced National Seismic System, as it was called at that point, of about 125 stations across the lower 48. There would be what was originally called Bigfoot, or the Transportable Array. There's 400 stations, and move over between 1,500 and 2,000 sites in 10 to 12 years. So that's essentially what's been achieved. And then there would be the Flexible Array, which would have a pool of 200 short-period stations, 200 broadbands, and 2,000 high-frequency stations to do active source experiments. This sort of development didn't just materialize. This wasn't sort of a discussion that said, oh, it makes sense, let's have 400 stations of broadbands and we'll roll them. Let's take a flexible array pool and we'll do 200, 200, 2,000. As Ann Meltzer described, this required many hours, many days, many weeks, and many meetings and workshops for the community to have a full-body discussion about what made the most sense in terms of budget and in terms of enabling the best science. So early on, these are a couple of the components of USArray. The first is the transportable array, so-called Bigfoot site. It's probably difficult to read the details of some of the text, but the point is that there would be a large bank of solar panels as required, GPS receiver, telemetry, near real-time telemetry. In 2003, that was a huge deal, the fact that you could bring the data back and actually see it within roughly an hour of it being recorded on site. That certainly was being done for real-time networks, but to imagine that you'd have 400 stations that were moving and actually get those data within just a few hours was a major challenge. And one of the ways that actually was achieved was not just with satellite telemetry, which is shown here, but the fact that cell modems were being developed, the bandwidth of the cell service across the US was being increased dramatically, and that access to multiple networks could be achieved in many regions of the lower 48. That actually brought the costs down as well, too, and enabled the project. Here's the flexible array. So this is a range of sensors, as you saw before, everything from broadbands to short periods to high-frequency sensors like these geophones that are shown in the bottom. Basically, the ability to go in and do Pascal-style arrays, ideally within the backbone of the transportable array, but certainly not required, and that this increased the capacity at the Pascal Instrument Center to do very large projects of controlled source seismology as well. And you'll see at this meeting, and you've seen at others, that these kinds of arrays are not just being used, have not just been used for for controlled source experiments, but are actually being used in array configurations to passively record things like tremor and very small scale seismicity. Okay, so this is another iconic image as USArray was being developed and moved along. Here's what the actual plan was. In what's called year 2 of the project, there would be 48 stations in the southwestern US, primarily in California. Many of these were enabled by some installations, but also taking some of the existing broadbands and just including the TA network code, so kind of turning on the network immediately, which is very useful to get a jump start. But by the end of year 3, almost 200 stations being deployed, moving into year 4, and year 5, 600 stations deployed, covering the Rockies to the west. And here we are in year 10, and in this map, finishing things off in the East Coast. So again, here's USArray status as of yesterday. Every time I look at this map, it doesn't matter how big the triangles are, the fact that you see over 1,600 stations sitting in the lower 48, many still operating through TA station adoptions, the fact that we have moved into southeastern Canada to try and fill a gap in the original network, and finishing things off in the next year is incredible. And here's all of EarthScope as well, so you can see many of these other stations, including the magnetotelluric transportable array. You'll see science results from that, and there was a workshop yesterday about where to go next beyond those footprints that you see with the diamonds with the red around them. And I just want to consider a couple of things. These are highlighted by some of the other talks. But the first thing is, do we take USArray and EarthScope for granted? Do we take any of these large facilities for granted? Many of you started your graduate careers. The EarthScope network was already developed, so you just grab the data and go. I certainly do that as well. And so forgetting kind of what goes into the development of these projects is easy to do. We can certainly accept the fact that this is a great legacy data set. Maybe this is the one we just need to hang on to for 20 years and just continue to process the data. That might be the right approach. Another approach would be to consider what the next big thing is. And as Anne clearly communicated, I like the way she presented it. I mean, there has to be a reason. It's not because we did a big thing and we want to do another. So hopefully many of you will go to the next big thing session and the Ignite session tomorrow night and think about what's best for the community. Are we where we want to be now? Is this what we actually need for now, and we can sit for another 10 years or so and develop something else? That might be the right answer. Or the right answer might be that there's another major need for the community, not another USArray, for instance, but another major need for the community that will require that decade-long planning. Another thing to consider is, if you want to do something like this, do you need a consortium? IRIS and UNAVCO were both instrumental in developing this. You couldn't start a PBO or a USArray without having the consortium in place. Finally, timing is key. We need to get that right. We don't need to be in a hurry, but we also need to build community consensus and make sure that there's opportunities through both the community and the funding agencies. And then how can we leverage partnerships beyond just our own scientific community? We see EarthScope drawing together quite a number of communities, but how can we draw in other funding agencies as we try to consider what we might do in the future? Thank you very much.